Hi, everyone. Today we are going to talk about ecology or the study of ecosystems. So, ecology is then looking at the scientific study of the interactions of all of the organisms and their environment. Okay. Variables that affect an organism include both biotic and abiotic factors. Now, bio, of course, means living. So if we're talking about a biotic factor, we're talking about a factor that is living. And it's going to include all of the animals and the organic material that's associated with those animals. It's going to include plants. It's going to include anything that is living. And I've given you a list there: blue crabs, zooplankton, phytoplankton, jellyfish, dogs, cats, humans, etc. would all be considered biotic. Now, a before a word generally means it does not or it's without. So abiotic factor means without life. So those are going to include things like the air we breathe, the water we drink, sunlight, our basic climate, the temperature, the altitude, the nutrient enrichment, that carbon, that oxygen, that hydrogen, that nitrogen. It's going to include how much water is in our environment, so humidity, and again, that dirt, rocks, pebbles, etc., are all going to be considered abiotic factors, so the non-living components in the environment. An organism's habitat includes both the biotic and the abiotic factors in their surroundings. To be successful, we already know this. Organisms must be able to adapt to their environment. So, in other words, they have to be able to adapt to the abiotic factors that are present in their environment. So, if we take this polar bear, for example, you remember he has to already have the genetic makeup that gives him that extra coat of blubber, gives him that hair, in order to be able to adapt and survive in that extremely cold environment. So, what is an ecologist? An ecologist is somebody then that studies these interactions of organisms and their environment. And so, if we go back to like almost day one of biology, we talked about those levels of organization. We've co- we've covered atoms and molecules. We've covered organelles and cells and tissues, and we didn't really hit organ systems. We've talked a little bit about the organism and the properties and processes that affect organisms. Now we're moving into ecology. And so now we're looking at that organism and its interaction with other organisms of the same type, so the same species living in one particular area. So we could look at the population of individuals all living in Phelan, for example. We could look at the population of people living in Wrightwood. We could look at the people or the population of people living in Pinion Hills. And in our area, we refer to all those populations of people living in those three different areas as a community. Okay, so the community is all the populations of organisms living close together. Now, in a community, we also have to consider all of the other populations of organisms living in that environment. So we could have a population of people, we could have a population of dogs, we could have a population of snakes, we could have a population of birds, we could have a population of you name it. And if we look at how all of those populations are interacting together, that is what makes up the community, or all those populations of organisms living close enough together so that they are interacting with one another. Now, our next level is the ecosystem. And the ecosystem is where we consider both the abiotic and the biotic factors. So, how are those populations of individuals not only interacting with the community, but how are they interacting with the abiotic factors? Is there enough oxygen? Is there enough water? Do they have shelter? Is there sand to walk on or gravel to walk on? So, is there enough carbon? Is there nitrogen? We're looking at, again, those abiotic and biotic factors and how they affect those communities or those populations within those communities. And then the biosphere would be our largest level, and it is the kind of the umbrella or the most inclusive of the levels of organization, in which it extends above the atmosphere several kilometers and descends down to the depths of the ocean. So it's including the hydrosphere, the atmosphere, and the lithosphere. So the atmosphere, of course, is the air, the lithosphere is Earth, and the hydrosphere would be the water that is surrounding the continents that we are walking on. And of course, so this would be our biosphere, and then we would be referring to all of the various ecosystems that are within that or making up that biosphere. The science of ecology and the environmental issues it oftentimes raises are related, but they are also considered distinct processes. So, for example, in the 1950s, it was thought that nature was a force to be tamed and that humans could actually control it the same way that livestock has been domesticated over these years. So, all we had to do was tame nature and we would be successful. Now, let me give you an example of that. Here is a chemical called DDT. It has a really long, awful name, but DDT was a chemical pesticide that was widely used and actually enthusiastically embraced by society, because if we sprayed our environment with DDT, then we got rid of disease-carrying vectors like mosquitoes, and it was thought that we would be healthier overall as a society. So here is actually an example of a truck that's driving down the beach and it's spraying the beach with DDT. And it just so happens that people didn't know that there was a problem with this chemical. And so you can see like this little boy standing here getting hosed down with DDT. Now, in the late 1950s, this led to a very heated debate because consumers started raising questions about the residue that was left over. Because not only were they spraying people that we saw there, but they were spraying crops, they were spraying food. We know that many insects get into our food. We got worms, we got bugs, etc. They get into our food, they eat our food. And sometimes when that food appears in our kitchen, we have bugs in our food and it's just not very attractive. So the DDT would take care and get rid of those bugs and give us better crops. And hence, when you put it in market, there were no bugs and so on. Scientists also found, though, that DDT remained in the soil or the water long after the application of the pesticides. And what we discovered was that the birds of prey, pelicans, for example, eagles, for example, were really vulnerable to this pesticide. So in 1962, Rachel Carlson, who was a marine biologist, she wrote this book called The Silent Spring. And what she did is she presented the evidence and the consequences that occurred due to this widespread use of these pesticides, or particularly this DDT. And that it brought on a whole mess of concerns, and especially the concerns of the loss of populations of organisms. So we're going to watch this short little film on DDT. Let me make sure my volume's adjusted here. Okay. Here we go.
In 1943, the first 6 pounds of DDT arrived in the United States. It was tested by various government agencies, and before...
Okay. All right, so we're going to watch this short little clip on the rise and fall of DDT in America. Here we go.
In 1943, the first 6 pounds of DDT arrived in the United States. It was tested by various government agencies, and before the war was out, we were producing tons of it. Then after the war, the use of DDT expanded into agriculture, forestry, and commercial and residential. It was used in hospitals, it was used everywhere. The peak year for its use was 1959, when there were 80 million pounds of DDT applied in the United States. So, again, by the end of the 1950s, 1960s, DDT and a host of now other related insecticides that were chemically similar had come into really widespread use. In 1945, Rachel Carson learned that the Fish and Wildlife Service had been doing tests on DDT at the Patuxent Research Center in Maryland, which is very near where she lived in Silver Spring. And these tests indicated that DDT maybe wasn't as harmless to other forms of life as had initially been thought.
At his press conference on August 29, 1962, President Kennedy was asked,
"There appears to be growing concern among scientists as to the possibility of dangerous long-range side effects from the widespread use of DDT and other pesticides. Have you considered asking the Department of Agriculture or the Public Health Service to take a closer look at this?"
Yes, and I know that they already are. I think particularly, of course, since Ms. Carson's brought, but they are examining the matter.
The presidential commission that Kennedy ordered, as I mentioned earlier, essentially confirmed that Silent Spring was correct. It didn't really have any enforcement authority at that point, so not a lot changed at first. But Carson was asked to testify before the United States Senate.
biologist Rachel Carson, who also wrote The Sea Around Us, worked 4 years in the preparation of Silent Spring. What she wrote started a national quarrel.
Chemicals are the sinister and little recognized partners of radiation in changing the very nature of the world, the very nature of its life. These sprays, dusts, and aerosols are now applied almost universally to farms, gardens, forests, and homes. Can anyone believe it is possible to lay down such a barrage of poisons on the surface of the earth without making it unfit for all life? They should not be called insecticides, but biocides.
After her death from breast cancer in 1964, the environmental movement continued to pick up steam with Silent Spring as kind of one of its main touchstones. The formation of the EPA in 1970 by the Nixon administration was something that Carson and her colleagues had discussed for a long time as being something that the government needed to have. And then in 1972, among the first orders of business for the EPA was to ban DDT and about a dozen other closely related insecticides.
Okay, so we're going to look at another quick little clip on biomagnification and toxins and how they affected the bald eagles.
America's national symbol, the bald eagle, neared extinction decades ago, but is now back thanks to the efforts of preservation centers like the George M. Sutton Avian Research Center in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. One of the suspected threats to the eagle surfaced in the 1950s. It all goes back to an insecticide called DDT, which in 1940 was hailed as a magic bullet when it was introduced to the market for use against insects carrying diseases like malaria. DDT was immediately popular around the globe. In Taiwan alone, malaria cases fell from 1 million to only 9 after 25 years of use. DDT was also widely applied to crops for pest control. Since it doesn't dissolve in the rain, it persisted in the environment. It was only in 1944, when traces of DDT started showing up in human fat storage, that experts grew concerned. Several years later, DDT was detected in the milk of nursing mothers, and then it was subject to massive research. DDT was found to be accumulating in eagles also, and by the 1950s, naturalists reported a decline in eagle populations that they blamed on the chemical. They theorized that DDT reduced the amount of calcium in the eagle's eggshells, creating eggs that often broke during incubation. DDT had bioaccumulated in eagles by traveling up their food chain. DDT residue from agricultural runoff contaminated water, river sediments, and the plankton living there. As smaller fish fed on the plankton and DDT-laced water, their concentration of the chemical increased. Larger fish, like trout, fed on the smaller fish, and over time their levels also grew. At the top of the food chain, the bald eagle's steady diet of tainted fish produced levels of DDT up to 10 million times the levels found in the water. To increase bald eagle numbers, scientists at the Sutton Avian Research Center transferred eggs from nests in Florida, incubated and hatched them, then raised the eagles, eventually releasing over 300 eagles throughout 5 states. The bald eagle was not the only bird affected by DDT. The osprey, another fish-eating raptor, saw its numbers decline, and the brown pelican, the state bird of Louisiana, may have been driven to near extinction because of the same soft eggshell issue. Even though it was never proven to be harmful to humans, in 1973, DDT was banned from production in the U.S., and several bird populations increased. Since DDT substitutes can cost up to 23 times more, controversy over its use still exists in poorer countries, battling malaria and other insect-borne diseases.
We're going to watch one more short little clip on pelican eggs and how they are affected by DDT and compare those to eggs that are unaffected.
Okay, I've got 2 eggs here. This egg is a normal chicken egg. You can see it's a pretty normal egg. You could crack it if you wanted, but it's pretty tough. Eggs have a shell that's made of calcium, and they're pretty strong. The mother bird can sit on them, and it won't break. You know, you can crack it if you cracked it on the edge of a bowl or dropped it on the floor, but still pretty strong. This egg is an egg that simulates what happens when an eagle lays an egg if the eagle has lots and lots of DDT in its body tissues. Now, if you look at this egg, when I tap it, it's not making any noise, and look what happens when I poke it. It has a shell, but the shell is very, very thin. This is an example of what an egg is like if it's laid by an eagle that has lots of DDT in its body tissues.
Okay, so what is biomagnification? Hopefully from that film, you kind of got some kind of idea about it. But when we look at it, we're going to talk a little bit more about food chains here in a minute. But what we're looking at is we're looking at a food chain in which we have a large bird of prey that's eating a fairly large fish. And then that large fish eats smaller fish. Those smaller fish eat plankton. And of course, those plankton are going to eat like small seaweeds, plants in the water. So what happens is DDT, when it gets into the water, then the plants take up that DDT. The animals that are eating the plant get some of that DDT in their system. So here's how much DDT got in the water, 0.000003 parts per million. The zooplankton that was eating the plants ended up with 0.04 parts per million in their body, because think about what's happening here and these are referred to as trophic levels, which represent how much energy is available at each level, or in this case, it's telling us how much DDT is in the body at each level. So in this case, zooplankton, they're fairly small. They eat plants for their food, and as a result, they get this buildup of DDT in their system. Well, then you have a small fish that's eating the zooplankton, and a small fish is going to eat a lot of zooplankton because a small fish is bigger than zooplankton, and they're going to depend upon a large population of these zooplankton to maintain their metabolism. So if we look at the small fish, they end up with 0.5 parts per million of DDT in their body. The even larger fish is going to eat a large population of the small fish that ate a lot of plankton, that ate a lot of plants. And as a result, look, we end up with 2 parts per million, significantly more DDT. And then that bird who's eating a lot of large fish ends up with 25 parts per million DDT in their system. And this is what we refer to as biomagnification, the magnification of this organic material building up in a body system. This is one of the reasons why sometimes you hear pregnant women shouldn't eat a lot of fish because there's mercury in that fish. And that's because, remember, those large fish, those like tuna, are eating smaller fish that are eating zooplankton, that are eating plants that are embedded in the soil in which the mercury deposits itself. And so as it biomagnifies up into the food chain, when you're eating it, you are ingesting a lot of that mercury, which can have an adverse effect on the growing embryo. So that's the reason. Now, the process by which a compound then, such as a pollutant or a pesticide, increases in its concentration in the tissues of organisms as it travels up the food chain is referred to as biomagnification. And here we're looking at some of those eggs that were affected by this DDT. So climate determines the distribution of communities. Most climatic variations are due to the fact that our globe or our biosphere is tilted, and the uneven heating of the Earth's surface as it orbits the sun, because we're at an angle, sets up various patterns of precipitation and prevailing winds. We also know that there's a huge ocean out there, and the currents that are occurring out in the ocean are also going to influence coastal climate. Also remember, those large bodies of water are going to absorb a great deal of heat energy, which are going to help cool down areas around these bodies of water. Landforms such as mountains are also going to affect rainfall. Some of you have heard of the shadow effect that occurs. This here is looking at our planet Earth. And what we see is, if we start, first of all, we're looking at climate here. We're looking at patterns. If we look at 0 degrees latitude, we have 30 degrees north, 30 degrees south latitude, 60 degrees north, 60 degrees south and north latitude. So Arctic's up here, Antarctic down here. As the Earth is rotating around the sun, we know that the sun strikes most directly at 0 degrees, hence it's very hot at the equator. And then if we look at the angle of the sun, it's not the sun that's changing its angle. It's due to the tilt on Earth and the way that the sun reflects off of the Earth, that we get lower angles of incoming sun occurring at the northern and southern hemispheres, which is going to keep it darker for longer periods of time or lighter for longer periods of time, depending on that tilt. And then somewhere in between here at those mid latitudes. Now, we know that as the Earth is rotating around the sun, that we get, again, these different tilts. So, for example, the March equinox, that's when the sun is directly on the equator. The sun is most direct at either March or 6 months later in September. During the June solstice, this is when the northern hemisphere is tilted more towards the sun and we have summer, and the southern hemisphere is tilted farther away, which gives them their winter. Now notice what happens in December. In this December solstice, we have the northern hemisphere tilting away from the sun, so the angle changes and we have our winter. And in the southern hemisphere, you can see that the southern hemisphere is tilted more towards the sun, which again changes that angle of sun and gives them their summer. All right, so we also have air currents that are creating climatic changes. We know that moist air, that precipitation falls to the earth as it cools. As hot air occurs, that hot air is going to rise, and the moist air is going to end up rising. And what ends up happening is as the moist air rises and it cools, then it's going to fall. And so here we have our temperatures rising. Here, what ends up happening is as the moist air is released into the atmosphere and it condenses, it's going to fall. We're going to end up with trade winds at the mid-latitudes occurring. Notice that they are occurring in a clockwise direction in the northern hemisphere and in a counterclockwise direction in the southern hemisphere. And I like this drawing better. It gives us a little bit more in terms of these patterns. Here is where the trade winds are occurring, and notice they are clockwise in the northern hemisphere. They are moving counterclockwise in the southern hemisphere. But look at what happens between 30 and 60 degrees. We'll stick with the north hemisphere here for a second. We have a reversal of these wind patterns. Notice trade winds, clockwise direction, but then we end up with these winds moving in from the west and creating these westerlies so that these wind currents are moving in a counterclockwise direction. And then in this most northernmost hemisphere, notice that those winds reverse again. These are the easterlies. So we have wind patterns moving in from the east and creating these currents. In the southern hemisphere, we have similar patterns that we can see in which between 0 and 30 degrees, the wind, these currents are moving in a counterclockwise direction. In the westerlies, they change their pattern and they start moving in a clockwise direction. And then those easterlies again start moving in a counterclockwise direction. Now, if you think about what's going on here at the 0 degrees latitude is in the northern hemisphere. Let's see, I probably have to do them backwards from you. We have currents moving in, I can't tell whether I'm flipped around. So you'll have to pretend I'm doing it from my perspective. In the northern hemisphere, those currents are moving in a clockwise direction, and in the southern hemisphere, they're moving in a counterclockwise direction. So look at what happens when they reach 0 degrees. Those currents are moving in the same direction. That's why they are referred to as trade winds, because people that were wanting to travel by sail, they would want to pick up a trade wind and catch that trade wind in their sails, and it would push them along. What happens if the winds are going in two different directions? What ends up with is you end up with a stall in which you're not going to be going anywhere. So here's another look at these are ocean currents. And we can see that in this case, the ocean, and I guess if we look at this one too, we would also see that there's ocean currents that are occurring here. This just kind of blows it up a little bit. We see ocean currents in the northern hemisphere are moving in a clockwise direction, and those in the southern hemisphere are moving in a counterclockwise direction. Again, at the equator, coming together where you have those trade winds, we also have those currents coming together, which are going to help move ships along, move boats along under sail. All right, here is showing some of those climatic changes that occur due to interruptions in atmospheric conditions, like mountains, for example. Most of you know that we live in a rain shadow in which we have the San Bernardino Mountains or the San Jacinto Mountains or the San Gorgonio Mountains on the other side that separate us kind of from Orange County and us up here in the high desert. We are under a rain shadow where oftentimes if they are experiencing rain on the other side of the mountain, we get nothing. We are dry, we are arid. That rain doesn't make it over the mountain. All right, so let's look a little bit at biomes. And these biomes are making up these various ecosystems. Again, an ecosystem is where those communities or those different populations of organisms are all interacting with their abiotic factors. So in an aquatic biome or oceanic biome, in this case, we have several different zones that exist in this ocean biome. We have a pelagic zone, which includes all open water. This is where we're going to find not a whole lot of sunlight because it's very difficult for sunlight to penetrate down deep into a water column. And we oftentimes end up with some very large fish. Of course, we've got large whales and squid and all kinds of things living down deep in the ocean. The opposite of that would be the benthic. The benthic is the actual sea floor. So if you were looking at benthic organisms, you would be looking at organisms that are living on the floor of the ocean. Crabs, shrimp, worms, snails. those would all be considered benthic organisms. And there is actually a whole marine biology field out there that is considered benthic studies. That's one of the things I did for about 8 years as a marine biologist. I spent a lot of time with a microscope and sorting out benthic organisms from various ocean bottom samples that were brought in. Now, the aphotic, remember, A before something means without. Photo means what? Photo means light. So an aphotic zone is a zone in which there is no light. This would normally be very deep down in the ocean as well, but it could also be an area like a cave in which there's no light penetration. This is going to be an area that there's not going to be any plants because there's no sunlight, so there's no photosynthesis. There can be chemosynthesis taking place, or that synthesis of organic material using chemicals. But the primary organisms we're going to find down there is we're going to find organisms that are able to phosphorylate or undergo bioluminescence. This is some examples here. This is an anglerfish. It's kind of hard. I might have hidden it in this other slide here, but he actually has like a little lantern that comes off over the top of his head. And that little lantern, some people suggest that it's so he can see his way. Others say that is to attract somebody of the opposite sex. These anglerfish are kind of cool. The females tend to be larger than the males. And when it's time to reproduce, the male actually attaches itself to, kind of bites onto her, to the abdominal region, and he injects the sperm, but she releases some enzymes that will not allow him to release his bite or his jaw from her abdominal region. And so as those sperm fertilize the egg and embryonic development starts taking place, she's not eating. What she's doing is she is actually using some digestive enzymes to break him down to provide nutrients that are needed for that embryological development, which is kind of cool. The photic zone is the light zone. This is where light is penetrating for photosynthesis. This is where you're going to sometimes remember it as the intertidal zone. This is where we find coral reefs. This is where we're going to find a lot of those ray-finned osteichthyes, those bony fish. And you're going to find some cartilaginous fish, of course, because sharks will swim through here because there's lots of food available. All right, so this is looking at the oceanic biome as a whole. Okay, so this area would be considered the intertidal zone. This is the part where you might go out and walk and surf and swim and boogie board and stuff. And then you're going to have this drop off of the continental shelf. On our coast, this continental shelf is a very quick drop off. This is one that is very steep and very sudden. This is usually where you're going to find some of that subduction zone occurring. If you're on the East Coast, that continental shelf extends, it can extend out miles, 3 miles, 6 miles, be very shallow. If you ever get a chance to go down to the Keys, I've walked out about a mile all the way in the ocean, and the water never got past like my knee or my thigh. It was very, very shallow. But you can see that once you get past that intertidal zone where light is penetrating, you're going to head right out into that pelagic zone, that open ocean. This is the area that is usually your intertidal zone is going to be where the lifeguards are paying attention to people. This is the area in which oftentimes there's buoys out there that says don't go past here because that's the open ocean. And of course, that's where you're going to find a lot of these large organisms. And so you can see this is our photic zone. That's where light's penetrating. And then down below that, that is our aphotic zone. So about 200 meters down, light doesn't penetrate. All right, so we already know phytoplankton are plants. Zooplankton are the small little animals that are living in the pelagic photic zone. Coral reefs are also in that photic zone, and these zooplankton are providing animal or food sources for many of these animals living in the photic zone. I think they're kind of cool. All right, so here is an example of the marine biomes that are all over our Earth. You can see they're vast and they support a very large diversity of organisms. It's hypothesized that we have probably only visited maybe 10% of the marine biomes, and that there are lots of organisms out there to still be discovered. All right, so here's a picture of our intertidal zone. This is the one that you guys are most familiar with. This is where the ocean actually meets the land. This is where the shore is pounded by waves during high tide. And then as that tide goes out during low tide, this is the area that is exposed to the sun. Some of you will visit down there and see sea urchins and sea stars and sea anemones. We got it all right here. We've got some red algae, we've got sea anemones, sea stars, we've got a little bit of these are what are called bryozoans. We got sea urchins. We've kind of got a lot in that picture. All right, so switching gears a little bit to freshwater. Actually, an estuary is an area in which freshwater meets with ocean water. So this here is an estuary where this fresh water is dumping out into the oceanic water. This is an area which is going to have, because it's freshwater mixing with saltwater, the salinity is not going to be as high as ocean, but it's not going to be as low as in freshwater. So you've got an area in which if plants or animals are going to survive here, they have to be able to live in conditions that are kind of in between freshwater and saltwater. There's a lot of organisms that can adapt, but there's a lot that cannot adapt. Some of you might be familiar with the estuary down in Newport Beach. There's another one in Huntington Beach. You can go and rent a kayak or take your kayak. You can paddleboard through here. You can take your binoculars, do some bird watch. They have boardwalks and pathways, and it's a very nice area to visit. All right, the wetlands, one of my favorites. This is also a transitional area between that freshwater and saltwater, but it's more of a transition that is between aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. So we're talking about not just the water animals now, we're talking about the water animals and the terrestrial organisms that live on land. These are primarily found in areas like Louisiana, Georgia, Florida. This is areas where we're looking at crocodiles, we're looking at alligators, we're looking at various birds and turtles, and the water column is huge. You can't really build in this area. The estuaries could also be referred to as a wetlands, by the way. In fact, I think they do call the Huntington Beach ones actually the wetlands because we're looking at animals and organisms from the terrestrial side as well as the aquatic side. All right, so freshwater biomes. This is, of course, our rivers, our lakes, our streams, so standing water biomes or flowing water biomes. And these are intimately connected with the soils, so the abiotic factors, and the biotic or the organisms of the ecosystems that surround them. So all those plants, all the deer that come down, including the fish that live in the water and the insects that the fish are eating, or it's including all of those in this biome. All right, so let's look at the terrestrial biomes real quick. The terrestrial ecosystems, there's 9 major types. They are distinguished primarily by the vegetation that is most predominant in that area, and it depends on where they're located, what altitude they're at, the temperatures of that area, the precipitation in that area. Is there standing water available? No standing water available? Is it arid? Is it cold? Is it hot? So in other words, we're talking about the climate. The same type of biome may occur geographically in distant places if that climate is similar. So if you think about those various latitudes, I think think I have a map. Here we go. If we look at this map here, we'll see that, for example, if we look at, well, let's look at the equator. We know that at the equator, we have what? We have the rainforest, right? Let's see. Here we go. Tropical rainforest. And in the tropical rainforest, we know that it's hot. We know that it's humid. We know that it rains a lot. And if we look here in South America, in Africa, over here in the islands here off of Indonesia and India, we have similar climates. And let's see here, over here in the United States, we have Florida. That's it's a little tip right there. And I'm saying again. We have the tropical islands out there, the Cayman Islands. We have the Galapagos Islands that would be over here. We have Central America. Those would all be considered tropical forests. And then we can see, for example, we have the coniferous forest up here. We're going to have cold winters, mild summers. You're going to have a lot of conifers or pine trees, and so on. So tropical rainforests, these are in the equatorial areas. Daylight hours are 11 to 12 hours year round. There's a lot of rainfall during certain parts of the year. Enormous diversity of organisms and species live in the area, probably larger than any other place on this planet. They are subject to large-scale human destruction, that deforestation, which is continuing to destroy habitats for many of these organisms and endangering the lives of many populations. The savannas are warm year-round. They get about 30 to 50 centimeters of rainfall annually. They have a huge variation in seasonal changes. They may have periods of time in which there's a ton of rain, and then other periods of time where it's very arid and dry and there's no rain and they're susceptible to fire, because during rainy season you get a lot of grasses growing, ferns, and then in the summertime when it's really dry and arid, those grasses are subject to massive fires that can come through and wipe out the area. Insects are the dominant herbivores in this area. And again, that's because of the grasses and the ferns and the trees that grow as a result of heavy rainfall. The deserts are the most arid or the driest of all the terrestrial biomes. You know that we have low and unpredictable rainfalls. We have cycles of growth and reproduction in the desert that are keyed to rainfall. Most of you know we had a lot of rainfall this year. And what did we see as a result in the spring? We saw huge bursts of poppies burst up. If you drive down 138, there's all kinds. I was amazed the other day. I drove down through there and there's blue flowers and purple flowers and red flowers and orange flowers and flowers and other vegetation that we haven't seen in a couple years due to dryness. I love the cycles in the desert because of that. We also know the other great thing I love about the desert is during the daytime, it may be really, really hot and we've got to turn on our swamp cooler or air conditioner. But at nighttime, what can we do? We can turn that all off, open up the doors and windows, and we will actually be kind of cold sometimes. So desertification, that is the conversion of semi-arid regions of the desert in which we are changing our environment. Some of you may go down to thinking Victoria Gardens. Victoria Garden area, that used to be primarily like a desert or a chaparral type area. It was fairly dry, not very humid. There weren't any houses, there weren't any malls or anything living down there, or constructed down there, I should say. Now, when you go down there, what happens? It's hot, it's humid. I hate going down there in summer because you're outside and you just sweat, and then you try to go in to try something on and you're all sweaty, and it just doesn't work out for me. But why is that? Well, one of the reasons is that we are building houses along with pools, and along with the pools come grass, and we're watering those grasses, and we're putting water in our pools. We're changing the environment because we're adding water to it. And so as the sun is heating on it, it's breaking those hydrogen bonds, and that water is evaporating into our atmosphere, which is making it much more humid. Now, the conversion of semi-arid regions to desert is another place or conversion that can be happening, in which we are removing water from the environment due to climatic changes, in which maybe there's too much pollution. Maybe I'm trying to think of an example and it's just not coming to me. But what we're doing is we're removing water, and those areas are becoming even drier and more desert-like and very difficult to live in. And these create significant environmental problems. Chaparral. We not only live in a desert area, but surrounding our desert area. In fact, if you drive down the 15 freeway, you are driving through areas that are referred to as the chaparral. They look just like the picture that I have exhibited here. We have dense, spiny shrubs with tough evergreen leaves. If you've ever tried hiking through these areas, we've got manzanita bushes and stuff that have these spines on them that some of you are familiar with manzanita. They have like red bark, and if you rub up against it, the spines will like scratch you, and it's not very fun to hike through them. Hot, dry summers, mild, rainy winters in these areas. Vegetation is adapted to periodic fires. You may have fires that race through this and these canyons in Southern California, which can be quite devastating. These chaparral areas are everywhere down here. You can find them in Riverside. You can find them in San Diego. They're kind of like where you don't have desert, where you don't have mountains. They're kind of somewhere in between there. The temperate grasslands is another biome. This is mostly a treeless area, except where there's lots of water along rivers or streams. They have relatively cold winter temperatures. They average about 25 to 75 centimeters of precipitation every year. They also will experience periodic periods of droughts. Historically, these have been grazed by large bison. So where are you going to find these? You're going to find these like in Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, so that Midwest area. You're going to find this where we have a lot of farms, a lot of corn will grow in this area, for example. I'm doing that terrible habit thing again. I'll try not to. Very productive farms have replaced most of North America's temperate grasslands. We have to be careful, though. We have to understand that we have to rotate our crops and we have to take care of the soil. Otherwise, we may end up with another dust bowl, as happened in the 1940s, 1930s, 1920s, as we overplanted and overgrazed our soil. All right, then we have the temperate broadland forest. Some of you might really enjoy this. Sometimes we refer to this as the temperate rainforest. This is like up in Washington, Northern Oregon, along that latitude where there's quite a bit of moisture that's going to support the growth of large trees. There's an annual precipitation that is also fairly high, 75 to 150 centimeters per year. The growing season is approximately 5 or 6 months of the year, and it creates an annual canopy of these broadleaf forests. Oh my goodness. I don't know if all my pop-ups are showing or not, but the trees in these areas, even though they are fairly tall, they're not necessarily got a lot of diversity. They tend to be of the same or very few types of trees in those particular climatic areas. The carnivorous forest, we have this up in Wrightwood, for example, Big Bear. These are where we're going to find, and so this has a lot to do with altitude. This is where we find the cone-bearing evergreen trees. We find the spruce, the pine trees, the fir, the hemlocks. The northern coniferous forest is referred to as the taiga. This is the largest terrestrial biome on Earth, which is pretty interesting. You would think that it was the tropical rainforest, but there's really not a lot of land or terrestrial area in the equatorial area compared to the northern coniferous area. Even though that is the widest part of the globe, we are talking biomes. So we're looking at the terrestrial biomes here, just to keep that straight. These are characterized by long, cold winters, lots of snow, short, wet winter or summers. I'm sorry. This would be areas like Yellowstone, for example, Wyoming in the northern part, up into Canada. The temperate rainforests of the coastal northern North America are also coniferous forests. The tundra. How many of you been to the tundra? Not me. I think I'd like to go, though. It looks really pretty, or if we could at least see these cute little animals. This covers an expansive area of the Arctic between the taiga and the permanently frozen polar ice. It's totally treeless here. There's no trees. I don't know if you've ever thought or been to Iceland. I thought it was very interesting that in Iceland there are no trees. There are no bugs because there are no trees or something like that. Anyway, the Arctic is characterized by a permafrost, which is a continuously frozen subsoil. Plants can't survive in it. And it's rather interesting because you may see it dotted, kind of like this picture here, in which it looks barren, like a desert. And that's because there are no plants, and oftentimes there is very little precipitation. When we watched the film on Your Inner Fish and they visited the Arctic there, or the area where they were looking for Tiktaalik, I should say, they were in the tundra, and you could see that they went during a period of time where there was no precipitation, so they could look for those fossil remains. Polar ice. This is the land north of the tundra. Much of the Arctic Ocean and the continent of Antarctica include the polar ice caps. Temperatures are extremely cold year-round. There's very little precipitation, and it's closely interacted or interconnected, I should say, with the marine biome in that area. And you should be thinking about those whitefish that are living in that oceanic or marine biome there. All parts of the biosphere are linked by various cycles, including the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the water cycle. Precipitation, evaporation, and transpiration are the characteristics of the water cycle. Remember, we have, as the sun hits water and breaks those hydrogen bonds, that water evaporates and moves up into the atmosphere where it cools and it condensates and it creates precipitation, rain, sleet, snow that falls to the earth and will percolate down into the soil, creating our water table and our groundwater. We'll also have some water runoff into the ocean, and the cycle repeats itself. So at this point in time, you should be able to define and distinguish between the different levels within ecosystems. You should be able to distinguish between the differences between biotic and abiotic factors. You should be able to know who Rachel Carson is and why her work was important. In other words, the DDT and biomagnification. You should be able to describe the abiotic factors that influence life in the biosphere. Describe adaptations that enable pronghorns to survive in the open plains and shrub deserts of North America. That's in your reading. And then we looked a little bit at climate patterns. We talked about climate. We talked a little bit about landforms. We talked a little bit about seasons, the winds, ocean currents. We talked about the ocean biomes. We talked about the freshwater biomes. We talked about, we talked about the 9 terrestrial biomes. We've talked about estuaries and wetlands, and how the biosphere is linked to the water cycle. So again, if you have any questions, make sure you contact me. Make sure you check part 2 of Ecology, and I will see you later. Bye. How do I stop?